Some of the most difficult cases involve a gray area, which is generally where the truth lies. But in many instances, that gray area is the toughest portion of a death to unravel. This week, I'm delving into the strange, untimely death of a young woman many of her friends and family believe was the victim of a well-planned, well-thought-out murder. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and true crime author. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Murder is such a strong word. Yet it has become so common within our public consumption of true crime stories today. I think it's lost some of its intended impact. We cannot ever throw this word around as though part of casual conversation while discussing true crime stories. It can never become second nature. Look, we hear it used on TikTok and other social media true crime platforms by irresponsible hacks, hoping for more clicks and likes, with no accountability for those involved or the truth. Not to mention victims' families. In the case I have for you this week, I implore you to steer clear of the social media nonsense surrounding the case and learn the facts. Ask yourself questions based on evidence. Depending on what we listen to and read, along with who is commenting, we could draw any number of conclusions in this case. I am going to go through the facts as we know them and try to point out when speculation or accusation enters into the fray, both of which are important factors in the public discussion about such an untimely death, with so many people seemingly having the answers to it. These are people's lives we're talking about here, either the victim, the victim's family, or even the accused. So let's begin on the night in question, March 23rd, 2012. Molly Young is 21 years old, about to turn 22 in a matter of weeks. Molly has this unique and rare look to her, sort of like a young, emerging Hollywood star. Golden blonde hair flowing past her shoulders, blue eyes, high cheekbones, a charm and smile that would fit right in on any red carpet. A student at Southern Illinois University, she is working for Victoria's Secret. She has two sisters. Her mother and father are divorced. Her father remarried. Molly lives in Carbondale, Illinois, Jackson County, in Southern Illinois, known informally as Little Egypt, with a population of about 20,000. The year leading up to this 2012 day had been tough for Molly. This is an implicit fact within the documentation associated with the case. According to official reports, she had been more than concerned for the past year about a surgery she'd had, which she had presumed was cancer-related. And close to 2 weeks before that March 23rd, 2012 night, Molly was said to have been prescribed medication in relation to an abortion she'd had. So she is in a rough spot, as anyone would be in her position. A place no one would want to be in, and no parent would want to see their young daughter going through. At about 2 a.m. on March 23rd, 2012, a male friend drops Molly off at the home she lives in with her grandmother. Molly and her friend had gone to a concert that night. Inside the house, a half hour later, unable to sleep, Molly texts her ex-boyfriend, a now public name figuring prominently at the center of this case, Richie Minton Jr. Molly and Richie had somewhat of a tumultuous relationship, very fragile and fractured over the past several months. One of the first texts Molly sends Richie that night speaks of how she, quote, didn't want to live anymore, end quote. Richie responds by saying, quote, nothing is going to happen to you. Don't talk that way. From that exchange, it's clear Molly is concerned for her health and that cancer scare. Based on several journals police later find, this health scare weighed very heavily on her and was, one could surmise from the documentation, all-consuming. Between the hours of 3 a.m. and 6 p.m. that same day, 16 hours, there is no communication between Molly and Richie that has been documented or released. So any talk of what happened between that first text and the next, in which Molly mentions what she is thinking, is speculation. And even from the few texts we do have, we don't actually know what she is feeling or what she is going through. We need to make that point here very clear. A text cannot convey emotion. An emoji cannot convey how you're feeling, what you're thinking. Richie texts Molly at 6 p.m. and asks if she is okay. 3 hours later, at 9 p.m., she responds, mentioning how she must have passed out before she could, quote, OD. The indication, assumption within that exchange is that Molly had tried to overdose herself. But we do not know that for certain, right? Richie is at a friend's house when the exchange takes place. Another important factor. Next, Molly texts Richie at 10 p.m., explaining to him that she is throwing up, with an indication how disappointed she is that whatever she had taken did not work. Did not work for what purpose? We do not know. Again, we can assume, but we just don't know. Richie texts back how much he still loves her and does not want her to do what it is he thinks she's trying to do. Molly's grandmother later confirms only that Molly was sick that night and vomiting, adding how the grandmother believed it was the stomach flu. In another exchange, Molly talks about wishing that she had a gun to make it easier to get the job done. Richie tells her to stop talking that way, adding, I love you. So now we begin to kind of assume even more that she's talking about suicide. I wish my mom would leave, she then texts, so I can find one of my grandpa's guns. Before texting 15 minutes later, I tried to kill myself last night. Richie did not respond to that second text, to which Molly responds, goodbye, Richie. And I just want to note something here. That text, goodbye, Richie. We don't know what that means. We can speculate that it means she is suicidal and she's saying goodbye, she's going to go through with it. But we could also speculate that she means, piss off, Richie. I am completely done with you. Because remember, he didn't respond to her. The point is, we do not know. It's 12:45 a.m. now on March 24. Someone we assume to be Molly sits at her computer and begins Googling suicide 25 times in total. Her computer also logs Google searches for how to get a gun 2 times. Richie, it should be noted, brought a bottle of Jägermeister, that German, liqueur in the green bottle, over to the house he is at when Molly begins texting him. This is going to become very important. A few hours after Molly's computer logs those Google searches, Richie and 5 others leave that friend's house and are now together at a bar in Carbondale. Richie is drinking heavily at the bar. Witnesses later describing him with a pitcher of Jack Daniels and Coke. Richie and those friends then head back to an apartment one of them lives in nearby. Richie, who was later said to be very drunk, actually drove. After everyone settles inside the apartment, one of the girls there, hanging out in the same room, begins receiving texts from Richie about going over to his place so they can sleep together. The girl repeatedly and emphatically rejects him. Okay? They're in the same room. He's texting her. She rejects him over and over. Several of his friends then drive Richie home to his apartment. He has a roommate who is not home from his job at the time. It's about 2:30 a.m. by now. That roommate had sent a text to Molly that night asking how she was doing. Having heard, we can only assume from Richie that she is struggling. She texts back that things are not well with her. Richie's roommate reassures Molly that whatever is going on in her life, it's not worth killing herself over, and things will get better. Richie is at his apartment now alone. Near 3 a.m., he calls Molly. Then he calls one of his friends and calls Molly back right after that. By 3:28 a.m., Richie sends Molly a text asking for her help. All that booze had hit him. He is beyond drunk by this point and obviously unable to take care of himself. Molly must have left her house right away because about 20 minutes later, Molly is calling Richie, who doesn't answer 3 of those calls. Maybe he passed out. The speculation is that Molly stood outside his apartment when she phoned him, letting him know she had arrived and needed to be let in. Molly then texts one of their friends 5 minutes after her last call to Richie, quote, "I'm over here now, taking care of Richie because he called me saying, 'Help me, Molly,' over and over. He's so drunk, he can't walk." Within 5 hours from the time of that text, Molly Young will be dead. I'll get into what happened after a short break. The Justice for Molly Facebook group has 23.6 thousand members. The About This Group write-up begins like this, quote, "Our beloved Molly Marie Young was brutally murdered on Saturday, March 24, 2012, end quote. A native of Marion, Illinois, which is about 17 miles directly east of Carbondale, Molly Young might have expressed an interest in suicide, done Google searches for ways to do it, and even talked and texted about it. But those factors alone do not mean that she was suicidal, or that upon her death, it should automatically be ruled a suicide. We just cannot assume that one leads to the other. We need to be certain. We need evidence. I've spoken to many parents over the years whose sons and daughters have died in what was thought to be suicide, but those parents did not believe the facts aligned to agree with such a manner of death. Look, I'm not someone who doesn't understand there can be denial and disbelief involved in these sorts of untimely deaths, okay? It's easy not to see things clearly when grief, horrible grief, is overwhelming you. But it does not mean we simply take at face value what appears to be a cause and manner of death. We have to rely on what the evidence tells us. Molly was adored by her parents and siblings. This is utterly clear from the reports I have seen about this case and a few news accounts quoting family members. At a memorial for Molly, her parents concluded the ceremony by playing the popular song, "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." Molly loved rainbows. With that theme in mind, I will say the overarching, most important facts of this case take place between the time Molly showed up at her drunk ex-boyfriend's apartment and the time his roommate calls 911 about 5 hours later. It is within that time period that the truth sits, waiting to be found. Molly had been asleep at 10 p.m., according to family, on the night before she headed over to Richie's early in the morning after he asked her to help him. That next morning, Molly's mother texted her daughter near 5:30 a.m. looking for her because Molly was not at home. When Molly fails to respond, worried, her mother heads out in search of her daughter. By 4:40 a.m., Molly is texting Richie's roommate, who is still not home. She says Richie, was texting that girl at the apartment with his friends the night before, asking her to sleep with him. "I think I'm going to shoot myself in the head. I'm really, really sorry if you come home to this." Okay? So she had found those texts from the night before, from Richie to that girl who rejected him. She's explaining this to the roommate, and she's saying she's going to shoot herself in the head. That's what we think she's saying, if she's the one sending that text. We don't know that. We're just assuming it because it came from her phone. Nobody knows how Molly got into Richie's apartment. The roommate's phone had run out of battery and he wasn't receiving texts, he later tells cops. So he didn't see this text, allegedly from Molly, in real time. We can speculate that Molly looked at Richie's phone when she got inside his apartment and found those texts he was sending the night before to that girl he was trying to sleep with. That's the assumption, not a fact. Richie's roommate gets home at about 5:45 in the morning. 5:45. According to what has been reported, he walks in, goes over to Richie's room, opens a door to look in on him. The speculation is that he sees Richie sleeping and then closes the door. He's asleep now. I just got home, the roommate texts Molly, apparently not seeing her inside the apartment. In Richie's room, dead on the floor next to Richie's bed. I don't know how that's possible, but that's the fact we have there. The roommate then goes into his room, plays video games for a while. Then he picks up his guitar, he plays with that for a time before jumping into bed and going to sleep. Near 9 a.m., the roommate calls 911 after Richie wakes him up and tells him he cannot find his phone to call himself. Let's just listen to that call for a minute.
911, what's your emergency?
Hi, we have a person at my living facility who we believe to be dead.
Okay, where's that at?
We're at 500. Here.
Hello?
Hello?
Hey, I'm at 500 North Westridge Drive, apartment A2.
Okay, and who is this to you?
It's my ex-girlfriend.
And how old is she?
She's 22.
Okay, and is she not breathing at all?
No, I woke up and she's covered in blood. She's overdosed. She bled out through the nose.
And you said she's 23?
22.
22? What's her name?
911, what is your emergency?
Hey, I'm going to send an ambulance,
Amber?
but they have a 1079.
Amber?
Yeah.
This is Richie. My girlfriend just committed suicide. Can you send an ambulance, or can you send a car over 500 North Westridge, apartment A2?
A2?
Yeah.
Yep, we'll be on our way.
Thanks, Amber.
Alrighty, bye.
Can I go ahead and hang up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hang up. I'll go ahead and send an ambulance that way, though.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So the roommate speaks first, and then Richie gets on, and it's clear in the call he knows one of the dispatchers. We'll get to how he knows her in a little bit. You can hear Richie's voice. It's clear what he says and how he sounds. And let me say this about that. There is no one way I have come to learn throughout my years of investigating untimely deaths and murders. Those who phone into 911 to report a death speak. Emotion and demeanor run the spectrum. Yet this call struck me in a few ways as being different from most of what I have heard and studied. There's no cause for alarm, number one. There's seemingly zero emotion, number two. There's a man talking about his ex-girlfriend dead inside his apartment with blood all over her, saying she has overdosed. And he sounds rather chill about the entire thing. Does that make him guilty of anything? Absolutely not. This might just be Richie's overall demeanor. What it does tell me, however, is something about him and his relationship with Molly Young. That he was done. Remember, he had texted her the previous night that he loved her. He seemed genuinely concerned. But I don't hear love or concern in this call. I hear a man reporting what he has discovered, which I might add, he is about to change, as if he is describing a scene on television or maybe a baseball game. In a second call that morning to the Carbondale PD's non-emergency number, Richie clarifies that Molly had, quote, apparently shot herself. In other words, he calls back and says, oh, no, it wasn't an overdose. She shot herself. I do not see how one could confuse the two. Of course, I wasn't there. But a gunshot to the head and an overdose are so vastly different from one another. It's almost unfathomable to me that one could confuse those two manners of death by looking at the person, someone with whom you claim to love. Moreover, Richie has blood on him. Every death has a scene attached to it. Not sure about calling where Molly Young is found a crime scene, but her body is located next to Richie's bed on the floor. Richie's .45 caliber handgun is partially exposed under the left side of Molly's body. Richie is sitting in the living room when police and paramedics arrive. Molly died from a single gunshot wound to her head. It is determined that the shot occurred at about 5 a.m. Or, it's important to note here, not long after she entered Richie's apartment. Richie Minton, one police report claims, had washed his hands before anyone arrived at his apartment. He tells police that he attempted to resuscitate Molly. While sitting in his living room after police arrive, he asks if he can change his clothes before he and his roommate go down to the police station to talk about what happened. Police tell him, sure, go ahead, change. The pajamas Richie is wearing have bloodstains on the lower right leg, front and back. The Illinois State Police are called into the case immediately. You see, Richie is a police dispatcher himself. He works for the Carbondale PD, which was why he knew the dispatcher when he called into 911. Imploring the state police to get involved and process the death scene and investigate what happened is a smart call by the Carbondale Police Department chief, considering Richie's employment. Things get murky from here. That gray area I spoke of at the top of the show, we're here now. Within a day, Dr. Raj Naduri, the pathologist, reports that the manner of death is suicide. There's no long explanation or prolonged report I know of discussing why or how the doctor came to this conclusion. Only suicide. 10 months later, there's a coroner's inquest. They determined Molly's death was caused by that gunshot wound to her head, but the manner of death is now quite different. Her death is reclassified as undetermined due to lack of evidence. Okay, so it's no longer a suicide. It's an undetermined death, or it's an undetermined suicide due to lack of evidence. Either way, there's questions. I find this interesting and confusing. Lack of evidence. What does that mean exactly? Was there a death reconstruction done at the scene? Was the roommate questioned extensively about the entire night and morning and the relationship between Richie and Molly? Was the roommate's phone thoroughly gone through by computer forensics? Richie's phone, the same. Why did the roommate not see Molly's dead body when he checked in on Richie? I don't know the answers, nor do we know if any of this was done or what the results are. The Jackson County State's attorney then looks at the case, reviews everything. He finds insufficient evidence to bring charges of any kind against any individual because he cannot make a case for homicide, again citing that lack of evidence. And look, lack of evidence is not evidence of a crime. The state's attorney goes on to say in his 21-page report that Molly's death, as an investigation, should remain open. He also explains why he cannot charge the case as a homicide, noting specifically that police found a suicide note back inside Molly's bedroom at her grandmother's, written on the same day she died, with a section of the note addressed to Richie, in addition to the journal entries from a journal Molly kept indicating that she didn't want to live, that she did not feel loved and wanted to end her life, along with those web searches for suicide. The texts from that night and the previous nights where she spoke of wanting to end things. And a text they found on her phone reportedly explaining why she was taking her life. So it appears, from all of that information discovered during what feels like a comprehensive investigation into Molly's death, that Molly Young committed suicide. And the implicit speculation in the report is that she went over to Richie's because she knew he had a gun, though the report never mentions this. Also clear from the texting evidence is that Richie asked her to come over that night, and she didn't go over to his apartment until he texted and said he needed her. Many of Molly's friends and family believe that Richie shot Molly, murdered her. A comprehensive report of the incident from 2014, written by the state's attorney's appellate prosecutor, goes through the accusations and possibility that Richie committed murder. The evidence part of this document begins with the .45 caliber handgun used in Molly's death. The report notes that there were no impressions found on the gun suitable for comparison to known fingerprints. So, according to this report, experts could not compare Richie's fingerprints to anything found on the weapon. Strange, I would think, because the weapon is owned by Richie, and you would think his fingerprints would be all over the gun. They concluded on this matter that the finding was not unusual, citing how problematic it is to retrieve prints from a gun with uneven surfaces such as serrated stocks and grips. Boy, I got to tell you, that's a head scratch moment for me. Prints are found on weapons all the time. If the weapon was wiped down, well, that would be a good reason you wouldn't find any prints. The report went on to say how they considered that since it was Richie's gun, there would be no reason for him to wipe it down. That is an enormous speculation. Okay? That's jumping from A to Z. Apparently, Richie had several scratches on his back. The question in the report is this: could Molly have inflicted those wounds? The state police lab found DNA underneath Molly's fingernails from 3 different males, one of whom is Richie. The report's conclusion there is that the amount of DNA found underneath Molly's fingernails was not enough to indicate whether it was from casual contact, a hand towel in the apartment, or touching something that Richie touched. The report even goes on to say that the scratches could have come from Molly, yet they speculate how there's no way to tell if it happened during an altercation or, as Richie told police, when he went to go resuscitate Molly, she must have scratched him. Or when she helped him into bed because he was so drunk, remember he couldn't walk, she must have scratched him. Again, speculation. One of the police reports, however, speaks about inconsistency on Richie's part. When they showed Richie the scratches, he replies that they must have come from Molly when I was cleaning the blood out of her mouth to give her CPR. Another cop in the room during this interview with Richie reported how Richie became subdued, speaking in a low voice after being asked, making a comment about wiping blood from Molly's mouth, adding how, as he walked through the apartment with no shirt on, he must have scratched himself. So now we have like 4 different ways that Richie could have been scratched. We don't know. Apparently he doesn't know. Those are bizarre and obvious inconsistent explanations requiring further investigation, which I cannot see was done. It's as if Richie's explanations are sufficient enough. I want to go back to that 911 call and then the follow-up call. Richie first says she OD'd, and then she shot herself. But here in the reports, he talks about removing blood from her mouth to do CPR. So it's clear then to him what happened to her. I just keep coming back to the fact that the truth is inherent. One does not have to recall the truth because it is part of who you are. And it's clear from Richie's demeanor on the 911 call and when police arrive, he's sitting calmly in the living room, remember, and asked to change his clothes, that he is not displaying any distress for whatever reason. I mean, as I go through this report, it produces more questions than answers. And in fact, the answers it does conclude produce even more questions. Then we come to the gunshot itself. How in the hell did Richie sleep through Molly shooting herself in his bedroom, literally feet away from where he was passed out on the bed? We know she shot herself. That's clear now. We know Richie was in the room. How does the guy sleep through a gunshot? The findings in the report claim that it's highly possible, however improbable, that Richie could have slept through the noise of the gunshot and that, holy moly, get this, under the circumstances, he probably had not recognized the sound as a gunshot. The writers of the report then go into the amount of noise a gunshot makes. Depends on the firearm itself. Very true. Then they say how the sound can be muffled when pressed against soft tissue. Well, that's bullshit. Yes, you press a gun against the back of your head, you're going to muffle some of that sound, but you're going to hear the gunshot. Remember, it's 5 feet away, 6 feet away. I do not understand those statements. They make no sense to me and do not belong in an investigative report because it's all wild speculation. So then we come to the GSR, gunshot residue. The GSR test of Richie failed to show any residue. But we know he washed his hands and changed his clothes, right? That being said, quote, GSR was deposited on virtually everything in the room, including Molly's shirt sleeve. Everything in the room, that is, except Richie. Molly did not have any residue on her hands. The reasons they give for this is the possibility that the particles were removed by activity post-mortem. This revelation in this report floored me. I have read hundreds of autopsy reports, thousands of pages of police and crime scene reports, and I do not ever recall, not once, seeing anything like this. In other words, Molly's autopsy removed any possible GSR she might have had on her hands. The report to me feels like it goes out of its way to exonerate Richie when its intended purpose is to stay objective and report what is found by the evidence available and come up with facts. It's full of what I will call exonerating speculation and hyperbolic opinion. It goes so far as to report this gem. Quote, the investigation shows that it is unlikely that Richie called and texted Molly for help in order to lure her to his apartment so that he could kill her. End quote. So the fact that he invited her over removes the motive to kill her and is evidence that he could not have committed murder? What if the murder happened in the heat of the moment? What if they got into an argument? Here are the facts. Richie calls Molly at 3:02 a.m. At 3:28, he then texts Molly with one word, help. Then Molly begins calling him back. Close to 4 a.m., Molly texts his roommate saying she's over to the apartment helping Richie because he's so drunk he can't walk. An hour later, she is dead. Then we come to this. Molly was right-handed. The shot to her head was made by a left-handed person. There is no contention there. Again, though, the report seems to explain this away, saying, well, most individuals who shoot themselves do so using their dominant hand, but that is not always the case. That is true, perhaps. But in that line of investigatory thinking, you could say most murderers are caught. But that is not always the case. Concluding this portion of the report, they again claim the evidence is inconclusive, adding how it is certainly possible that Molly could have shot herself using her left hand. They cite a bottle of pills and her phone found by her right ankle, speculating she could have been holding those items in her right hand, which forced her to use her left hand to shoot herself. So there's no chance, you mean, she could have put those items down first? Is that what we are to believe? WTF. More wild speculation. Those blood-stained pajama pants Richie took off at the apartment were tested. Once again, the findings were inconclusive whether the blood on the front of the pants is from spatter or transfer as Richie was trying to resuscitate Molly. Yet, within this paragraph of the report, I believe there is a very important piece of information. The examination of the pants found 50 drops of blood on the rear side of the right pant leg. They concluded here that there was no way to determine how the blood came in contact with those pants. The path the bullet took through Molly's head is an important piece of evidence as well. I'll get into that right after a short break, along with the appellate report's incredible explanation of its result. Be right back. According to the state's attorney's appellate report on Molly Young's death, the bullet that killed her entered 2 inches above Molly's ear to the rear of her skull. We know that lateral, side-to-side paths are more common in suicides. In other words, this angle the bullet took is kind of a strange path considering Molly's size and being right-handed and acting as one would assume one would be doing at such a traumatic moment in their life, irrational. It suggests someone taller pointing a weapon down at her. There are so many questions left to answer in this case. When you go online and start reading about the case and the response on social media, it tends to get even more confusing and open-ended. That noise social media creates in these types of cases is something, if you're truly searching for the truth, you have to squelch out. You cannot allow the wild speculation social media tends to fuel to infiltrate the facts and the evidence made available. The report talks about how Richie first says that Molly overdosed and then calls back to say she shot herself. It concludes that there is nothing suspect about this, mainly because when police arrived, they would ultimately find out she'd been shot. So there was no benefit for him to say this. That is not the point of what this evidence tells us, nor the job of such an investigative body writing up its findings. Again, that is a speculative observation of what Richie says. What if he didn't know he shot her? How could he not know, you might ask? Nowhere did I see in the report that a blackout, drunken ex-boyfriend could have shot his girlfriend and not even remembered. The only thing that would explain this, perhaps, would be the evidence, right? Which is what we are supposed to be relying on. And if a team of investigators are going to write a report of a suspicious death and speculate literally on every page, why not ponder the theory that he could have shot her and not remembered? They don't test Richie's level of blood alcohol until 7 p.m. on the same day, 14 hours after Molly's death. By then, it's too late to indicate how drunk he actually was. There's a footnote in the report I find most interesting. It talks about Molly's father being told by a private investigator 2 days after Molly died that Richie, his roommate, members of Richie's family, and their lawyer all met at a local Denny's before Richie called 911. The state police requested the surveillance footage from that time of the Denny's and even the surrounding businesses, but none of it was available. Remember, it's like 4 hours from the time Molly died until the 911 call. Just saying. In conclusion, the report says how tragic Molly's death was, but, quote, there is simply insufficient evidence at this time to charge anyone as accountable for a murder. I think I agree with that. However, it doesn't mean the investigation should stop. Richie Mitten has never been charged with the crime relating to this case. He is presumed innocent of anything. I think we need to be clear about that. We have to be careful about making accusations, and none are being made here. The biggest problem I see is the lack of further investigation and how the investigation was handled moment by moment after Molly's body was found. In March 2022, Molly's father, Larry Young, who has been pushing to change Freedom of Information Act laws and other legal issues surrounding Molly's case, seemed optimistic. Speaking to WSIL TV3 News in Illinois, he said he believed Molly was murdered. Quote, in the last couple of years, I've had a couple experts contact me wanting to help. They have a lot of new evidence that hasn't been investigated yet, end quote. Remember that suicide note, and I am using air quotes there, the investigation produced, which was said to be found on the floor of Molly's room when cops went over there to look around? Her father later said that the note never mentioned the word suicide and that it was a goodbye letter to everyone written a year before her death when Molly believed she was dying of cancer. The reason I mentioned this here at the end is because sometimes how we look at things can change the way those things look. Please, I'd be grateful if you could tell a friend about us and subscribe to the show. I'm doing this show independently now, so every listener counts. Till next time, be safe, be aware. Sources for today's episode are State's Attorney's Appellate Prosecutor's Report, Molly Young Death Investigation, 10/31/2014, along with various news reports. Crossing the Line is produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Talk Boom Productions. Written and executive produced by me, M. William Phelps, with Catherine Law. Audio mixing and mastering by Matt Russell.